Thank you all for the invitation and to the Sydney-siders for making it. Congratulations. I've been caught. I think we've all been caught in these sort of circumstances where you think you could travel on the day of an event and your entire day is spent at a departure lounge watching your flight go back an hour, another hour until it's cancelled, and then you try and get on another one. Now, it is true, I'm going to try and map Australia's emotional architecture, and this is for an electoral purpose, to show to you perhaps why we should be thinking in sort of Brexit and Trump terms about the Australian population today. Now, we do have some advantages over the Brits and the Americans. We've got compulsory voting, and we've got a tradition of politics by negotiation rather than all or nothing tribal warfare. Now, I say that advisedly because right at the moment we're watching our first government since the Scullin government in the Great Depression blow up before our very eyes on questions of ideology. But I might leave that to the questions, and I think I do want to give some opportunity for questions. So this is going to be a much shorter version of the thesis, but hopefully, given the brain power in the room, you'll be able to pick up the points very quickly. Now, I want to begin by referencing both the US election and the Brexit vote to set our frame. And the question of this particular presentation is, can a Brexit happen here? And if Brexit is going to happen here, what does it mean for your sector? Now, I'll put the answer to one side, but before I even address the issue, one of the reasons why I wanted to look at it this way is I think the responsibility in this sector is to keep an eye on the rest of Australia. So whilst you're generating excellence within your own patch, you are actually contributing, accidentally, as it turns out, to the separation of the winning parts of Australia with the parts that have been left behind. And this is why I'm referencing the Trump presidential election and the Brexit vote, both in 2016. Because I think we're pretty much clued up now. There's a lot of data being mined in both those jurisdictions. Tertiary degree, living in a cosmopolitan centre that's connected to the global economy, more likely to vote to remain within the European Union in the British context, and more likely to vote for Democrat rather than Republican in the US context. Now, just two bits of statistics, and these are that frame our little emotional journey through Australia. There's been two coin toss elections, presidential elections in the US. One was in 2000 and one was in 2016. Now, 2000 is your before. 2000 is before the digital disruption and before the rise of China and latterly India. So before the disruptions of the 21st century. Al Gore and George Bush, a 50-50 election. When the counties are counted up, George Bush has twice as many, or three times as many counties as Al Gore does. But if you were to measure up, if you would then match those counties in terms of the economic contribution to total GDP in the US, it's close to 50-50. The counties that voted Democrat, 54% of GDP in the US in 2000. The counties that voted George Bush, 46%. So your coin toss lands roughly 50-50, not just in terms of people, but income. Now that is pre the shocks of the 21st century. Before the tech wreck, before the Great Recession, as the Americans call it, we still call it a global financial crisis, i.e. somebody else's crisis, which we avoided, and before the rise of China, which I think most of the research in the US says is the elephant in their particular room, which is that it's no longer a white century. Now in 2016, we know it's another coin toss election. Trump lost the popular vote, but essentially this is a coin toss election. Hillary Clinton won fewer counties in total than Al Gore did in 2000, which means that Donald Trump won substantially more. He won 4 times as many counties as Hillary Clinton did. I'll start at the top. The Democrats, getting a bit over 50%, 51, 52% of the popular vote, their vote accounted for 64% of US GDP. 64%. Trump's electoral base, which won him the presidency on a minority popular vote, is only 36%. So what you see in those intervening 16 years is what they call the great sorting in the US. To the west and the east coast, a lot of the winners of globalisation, in the hinterland, in the rural areas and in some of the southern states, people who perceive themselves as losers from globalisation. Now, we don't have those extremes in Australia, we know, but we know also in the British election, something similar played out, This is in the referendum to leave or remain in the European Union. Off the top of their head, it's pretty straightforward now. 2 countries vote to leave, England and Wales. 2 countries vote to remain. It's within England where the story is. So the countries vote to remain are Northern Ireland and Scotland. Within England, London, Manchester, Liverpool are voting to remain. The rest of England is voting to leave. In London, Manchester or Liverpool, it didn't really matter whether you're a high or low income earner, whether you had a tertiary degree or whether you thought your kids would get a tertiary degree. You were still located in the parts of the UK that was connected to the world economy that you felt your kids had a shot at in the 21st century. If you were separated from the metropolitan centres and didn't matter what your age or your income profile was, you're more likely to leave because you felt that the rest of the world was probably moving a little too quickly for you. Now, there's a particular statistic, and I've been agonising over it for a while now, and I have done the Australian research, but I won't bore you with the findings here, but it is not dissimilar to the research that's been done in the UK. Towards the end of 2016, the Financial Times, towards the end of 2017, based on data comparing 2001 and 2016, the Financial Times probably unpacked this better than anybody else. In 2001, it basically did an age profile of all regions in the United Kingdom. And whether you lived in a city or a village or a regional town, your age profile was not dissimilar. Now, I'll only go to the over 65s. I won't go to the working age population and the kids because it starts to get a bit complex. But in 2001, just under 30% of people living in villages were aged over 65. So the villages are older than the metropolis, but not that much older. In the cities, it was... Sorry, I've got a second mic going. Maybe we'll turn this one off. And in the cities, it's 23%. Now, what that meant is, whether you lived in a village or a town, the rest of the country felt familiar to you. You had roughly the same proportion of workers, kids, and retirees. Today, and the data goes back to 2016, the cities are technically younger. They're younger because the proportion that are aged over 65 has fallen below 20%. In the villages, the proportion, not only age, but ageing is accelerating. So just under 1/3, just under 36, well, just over a third, so 36% of people living in the villages are aged over 65. That age wedge is the single biggest disruptor in British politics today. That age wedge is one of the things to think about in the Australian context. Because the way our overseas migration program is working, and you understand this on your campuses, the way our overseas migration program is working, it is clustering the winners of globalisation in your area, now whether it's in a capital city or in a regional town. All the other parts of the country are getting older by comparison. Why are they getting older? One, because the migrant that lands in Australia today is younger than the population at large and better educated, point one. That's your constituency. Point two, the internal migration that's going on in Australia is bringing the kids from the regions to the campuses. What's left in the regions? Well, they are receiving some people. They're not getting migrants from overseas. They're getting retirees from the metropolis going into the regions. So this age wedge, which is quite dramatic in the UK and does probably more than anything else explain the Brexit vote, this age wedge is also beginning to materialise in Australia. But before we go to the detail of the Australian story, understand what migration in the 21st century means. It didn't matter where you lived in the 20th century, whether you're in a high migration zone or a low migration zone, because the wave arrived in basically the same proportion. So the top group that arrived in any part of Australia would be the English. After the Second World War, it would be the Italians, and the Greeks would be second and third. From the 70s and 80s, it would be the Kiwis would be 2, the Vietnamese would be 3, and then later in the decade, the Chinese would be either second or third, with the New Zealanders still up there. When I look at the data for the capital cities in 2001, every capital city looked like the nation at large. Every capital city. The English were the number one immigrant group, and the second largest immigrant group in each capital city, bar 2, were the New Zealanders. The exceptions were Melbourne and Adelaide, where the Italians were still number 2. And the only reason the Italians were still number 2 in Melbourne and Adelaide in 2001 was the 1990s was a pretty awful decade for the Rust Belt, what was then known as the Rust Belt in the south. So you basically had a slowing of the intake in Melbourne and Adelaide, which sort of time froze it in the post-war program with a much larger number of Italians. Today, and I've done this journey a number of times, some of you in this audience may have heard it, but I'll give you the summary. Today, no two cities in Australia look alike in terms of their ethnic face. The national story today, and this is the story of the 21st century. So not only in the post-war period up until the turn of the 21st century did the migrants arrive in the same order, they also started in the same place. More often than not, they'd start at the bottom, and you'd measure the success of the program through the achievement of the kids, the Australian-born kids. And we've all been through secondary school in the Australian context, knowing that depending on when we came through, the dominant cohort in that schoolyard would have been lagged by about 10 or 15 years. The most recent arrived mass migrant group, Italians, Greeks. Before then it would have been Jewish refugees from the Holocaust after the Second World War. They would have been arriving in the 50s. The Greeks on campus would have been in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and then the Vietnamese and the South and the subcontinent. All that was a very familiar story in the 20th century, and it actually made it difficult. It made it difficult to drive the wedge between the high migration and the low migration zones politically. And I think this is a very important point to bear in mind when we start to think about what could separate Australia in the 21st century and what can make Australia do a Brexit-like thing to itself. Now, as I said, top of the post-war wave, every capital city has the same group at the top, and 6 out of the 8 have the same group at number 2. Today, no two cities look alike. In fact, 4 of our 8 capital cities have someone other than the English already at number 1. I'll start in Darwin because I'll start in Brisbane because Brisbane's the most interesting place to start in because that's where the biggest churn is occurring. The New Zealanders are the number 1 immigrant group in Brisbane and also on the Gold Coast. In Darwin, people born in the Philippines are number 1. The first Asian capital of Australia is Darwin. In Perth, it's the English. In Adelaide, it's the English. In Hobart, it's the English. In Canberra, it's still the English, but not for long. In Melbourne, it's the Indians, number 1. And in Sydney, it's the Chinese, number 1. Now, as I said, what distinguishes the migrant of the 21st century from the migrants of from the various waves in the 20th century is that they arrive younger and better educated than the population at large. Not only that, they're moving in different directions. So to the west, you're getting young English and South African migrants. To the north, you're getting young Kiwi migrants. To the southeast, you're getting young Chinese and Indian migrants. Populations of Melbourne and Sydney today, just under 40% of the nation at large. 75% of all Chinese born in Australia live in those 2 cities. 64% of all the Indians live in just those 2 cities. So what happens to a country that starts to look different? Different in a way that we've never experienced before. In the United States, where close to 400 million people, difference is assumed. It's baked in. It is their national story. Difference in Australia, difference driven by ethnicity and income and opportunity, difference reinforced on your campuses, makes it very difficult to hold a country together during the early decade shockwaves of the 21st century. Now, I'm not telling people in the tertiary sector to look at the rest of Australia as your friend and starting bringing everyone's kids onto your campus. That's not what I'm arguing. What I'm arguing is that there is a responsibility in the way you conduct yourselves in national debates not to give opportunity to the alienation of those that don't belong or feel they don't belong in the 21st century. Now, just a couple of stats to walk you through the difference. Now, the difference I've sort of located in capital cities, but the difference as it manifests on the ground across entire states is quite fascinating. And then I'll get to the political story. And I'll leave the political story for last. How are we going for time? We do want some questions, don't we? Yep. So 76 is not a bad start point because most of us are either born around that time or pretend we remember the 70s. 20% of the population born overseas. The single largest group still the English. The English don't outnumber the Europeans, but the English are 6% of the population, the Europeans are 8%. People born in Asia are only 1% of the population in 1976. In 1996, and this is interesting, so 1996, the year of Pauline Hanson. 1996, we're just on 24%, 25% overseas born, so it's clicked up. The English born still outnumber all the Asian born in Australia in 96. And I have a particular theory that Pauline Hanson is a kick-down kind of bully. I think she was happy to have a go at Asian Australians when the one nation vote exceeded the Asian population in Australia. But did you note when she came back the second time around, we were in danger of being swamped by Muslims, not Asians. Because the Asian-born population in Australia today is 4 or 5 times the one nation vote in Australia today. So looking at Australia, and as I say, at the turn of the 21st century, when it was still familiar everywhere, the thing about the post-war migration program is there was no group that could arrive after the English that would ever overtop the English in their own right. In the 21st century, running a demand-driven migration program where skills, and also bear in mind, why are people leaving India and China? They're not leaving India and China because these countries are broken. They're leaving India and China because these countries are rising. The last time in Australian history when we received migrants of that order was in the 19th century when people were leaving the empire, the crowded, corrupted England for the new land like Australia. So motivation of those particular migrants especially is interesting to note. They're not coming here because they're grateful for the opportunity in Australia. They're coming here because they're expressing a global version of themselves as the English did in the 19th century. I actually don't think that's a problem for us in terms of managing our cohesion. I think generically Australia and Canada have had so much experience dealing with the offspring of empires that I think we'll be able to get there in the end. It's the separation between the Eurasian haves in the southeast and sort of the English haves in the west and the rest of Australia, which for argument's sake is in the north and in the regions. That is the thing we need to manage. Now, I alluded to earlier these coin toss elections in the US in 2000 and 2016. We've had 2 coin toss elections. 2010, hung parliament. 2016, Malcolm Turnbull is returned with a majority of 1. We now know after a by-election in Wentworth for his old seat and the defection of a couple of Liberal members, basically the Liberal minority government is at the same shape that the Gillard minority government was in 2010. What happened in those 2 elections that drew them together? 2 states voted overwhelmingly for the coalition, Queensland and WA. 4 states, Victoria, New South Wales, and in each of these states, by the way, South Australia and Tasmania voted Labor. In the past, if you got a majority of seats in New South Wales and Victoria, you'll be guaranteed of forming a national government, a majority national government. In both these elections, 2010 and 2016, Labor wasn't able to form a majority, notwithstanding the majority it had on the floor in Victoria and New South Wales. Therein lies our risk, and our risk is this identity separation between the north and the west and the southeast. At the moment we're managing it quite well, but I think on your campuses there is going to be an acceleration of difference, especially in the southeast, from the north and the west. I'd be opening campuses up all over Australia, by the way, if it were me, in every one of your institutions. And I'd be looking to make sure that the Australian-born kids had landing rights on your campuses. And I wouldn't be spending too much time on, I wouldn't be slowing the intake from overseas, but I wouldn't let dollars drive that particular conversation. How you have this conversation with governments in future, I can't tell you how to have those conversations with governments in future, but you need to think about them. Because the consequence for us in 10 years' time, if there's a permanent white minority in WA and Queensland stopping a government from getting a majority on the floor in the parliament, there will be an election. It doesn't matter which cycle you're in, probably generated by an economic shock, a recession in Australia. We haven't had one of those in 27 years, where the party that is shooting for power says, I want to slash the immigration intake, even for a year or 2. Scott Morrison isn't doing this today, but even for a year or 2. The damage that that does to our political story at home, but also to our identity in the region. It's one thing for the Americans and the Brits to get all anti-immigrant. It's another thing again for us to get anti-immigrant when what we're telling the big powers in our neighbourhood, we don't want their kids. So I'll just leave that as the final thought. I'll probably have overshot, but we've got time for, I hope we've got time for questions. And you can ask me about what happened this week. Thank you.
Thank you to George. So a somewhat overwhelming, cornucopia of information there. You've really given us a lot to think about.
And I pulled a few numbers. I wasn't going to do projector because it's way too much scribbling I hear.
The key story, which is we don't have a national map.
No.
We have a series of maps.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Questions from the audience? An observation. I can't help noticing that flight TQ003 business class seating is all on stage. The seats down here are definitely economy sized. Sorry about that, everyone. Do we have an actual question for the speaker?
First, Mark.
Yeah.
Hello. I immigrated here in 1972 with my parents, predominantly because of the education.
Yep.
So we've built a life. My mother completed her doctorate a number of years ago. My father had a bachelor's. I completed a master's a number of years ago, and I've been able to have a wonderful life and do the things that I've been trained to do and also enjoy. Mainly, I think, through Multicultural Australia. Listening to the rhetoric from Senator Anning, Pauline Hanson, and to some degree Mr. Dutton about immigration, how does that impact Multicultural Australia?
Yeah.
And to what extent can universities continue to promote the message and support the message of Multicultural Australia?
Yeah. We talk about price signals, so we talk about an electoral impulse. So Queensland is nowhere near a majority migrant state. Brisbane isn't even at over 50%. And what I define by majority migrant state is first or second generation. You total them up, and nationally it's just under 50%, so 29% born overseas and another 20-odd% Australian born with at least one parent who's a migrant. That's the national picture. In Victoria, New South Wales, the ACT, and in WA, it's well over 50%. And in Melbourne, Sydney and Perth, it's well over 60%. But of course, WA, as I say, identifies white because the dominant migrant group to WA are the English. So 10% of the population still today. That's a white Australia level English-born population in Perth. In Queensland, close to 60% of the population is third generation or older, still. And that's why you will hear in Queensland. Queensland's a very diverse state, and there'll be some Queenslanders in the room that understand this. There's about 3 or 4 Queenslands at any given point in time. So politically, that argument is going to come more likely than not to come from that state. And the difficulty in the short run, politicians of the hard right of the Liberal Party and the LNP as it is in Queensland, because it's the merged Liberal and National parties and One Nation. The difficulty they'll have in the short term is that there's no majority nationally for that sort of argument. And it's quite dispiriting to hear an argument that you think doesn't add up intellectually or electorally. But the grievance is still there and it's real. And the grievance is about the separation of these parts of Australia from the winning parts of Australia in the southeast. Now, how does the tertiary sector deal with this? I mean, beyond just continuing to contribute to debate and supplying as much information as possible, also think about how do you distribute some of the benefits of the migration program. So there will be researchers in this room that should be thinking about decentralisation, should be thinking about hooking up the sort of whiter parts of Australia to the cosmopolitan centre. Doesn't mean everybody has to literally live in Melbourne or Sydney or Canberra to be able to do this. In fact, you wouldn't want to encourage the sort of population flows we've had the last 15 years into the future, because you get half the people living in just the 3 cities in the southeast and the other half of the people, and then you'll literally be in US territory, divided the whole way through. So don't underestimate that the grievance has a lived experience. It's not an irrational, it may offend, and it does offend, but it's not an irrational thought in that context for the people living there. So don't try very hard not to judge them, but try very hard also not to be condescending. They are your equals, they are all Australians, and our job, I think, as public commentators is to try and find stories that connect them all together, a common national story.
So that sort of answers some of the questions that are flooding in now through the event poll, which is, what do we need, a more unified story, or do we need a story that plays more to the diversity of experiences of migration?
I think it's the second point. I think the difficulty we have today is that we're still thinking in 20th and 19th century terms, and we know most of those terms are pretty phony anyway. Mateship, Anzac experience. They're sort of very male and very white. We haven't even got gender equality right yet in our national conversation, as we've seen this week in the federal parliament. I actually think if you could get gender equality done first as a society, I think the difference, and it's not difference, I think the diversity story is easy to tell. I wouldn't be advising any organisation to replicate Australia's ethnic face, but by adding more men in the first instance. I'd much rather replicate Australia as 50-50 male and female in your organisation before you think about the various layers of diversity. I've noticed the guys didn't applaud that. I'm not saying you should lose your job. I'm just saying that to get the layers of this story right, I think we need to add more female brain to our sort of, certainly our body politic.
That's a female brain up there.
It is buzzing.
I think we have a couple of questions now around getting the balance between international students and local students right in the higher education sector. That's not just universities, but across the board. How do you feel about a question like that? How would you answer that?
See, I can't answer it specifically to any of your institutions, but I can answer it more generally. What we've done in the last 15 or 20 years, which has turned education services into the single biggest export dollar outside coal and iron ore, which is an extraordinary story of adaptability and seizing, in a sense, our economic model has been able to tap the best brains in Asia as part of a global export story. Now, I think in per capita terms, we're now the second, are we the second destination after the Americans for foreign students? So we've actually passed the Brits. And when you think about what Brexit really means Britain losing its centuries-long advantage as an educator of the world's elites. So we're doing something right, but what has occurred in the short term is it's accelerated difference in Australia. Now, the tertiary sector hasn't created the difference. The tertiary sector is reflecting the difference. So I think the responsibility, and think about it more in terms of, I hate for you to think too pragmatically and too politically, because you can second guess yourself into political responses where just sticking to what you know is the better way to do it. But the political risk in the short to medium term is a Brexit-like decision in Australia, which is to slash the migration program, which will have an immediate effect on your campuses. It will have an immediate effect. How do you guard against that? So do some catastrophe thinking. How do you guard against that? What should the mix between your foreign and your local students, but not just the mix between your foreign and local students, the opportunity for your local students. I think the critical issue politically in the bits of Australia that aren't connected to the global economy is the idea that their kids don't have an equal shot. So the sort of disenfranchised American, and certainly the sort of I don't want to go for a generalisation in the Brexit because it's quite a multi-layered story. But the disenfranchisement in Australia in the 21st century will come from not having equal access to services. And if people think, whether that's true or not, if people think that the tertiary sector is not an option for their kids, that's one of the things I think you absolutely have to guard against. I don't think the mix is the issue so much, but I think it's the opportunity for the local born to maintain a constant sense of accessibility, if I can put it that way.
Okay. We can't.
By the way, how you talk to politicians about this, very, very complex. I wouldn't be having the funding argument with them anymore. In fact, I'd be helping them see the complexity of Australia, because I think one of the things, and I know this on both sides, they struggle with this story. I've been asked to tell this story a number of times to the public service, all off the record for them, but this is obviously all on the record. The difficulty they have is actually understanding the complexity. Now, the pressure that they're under is to react tribally to try and hang on to their base. So if you come at them with a funding story, you get a tick under one regime and you get a cross under another regime. That's not the discussion you want to have. You want to be above that petty discussion. In the same way that some institutions are still holding in the 21st century, the Reserve Bank, and I think the judiciary is still doing okay, certainly the High Court. You want to be there. You don't want to be in the on again, off again, depending on who's in power.
We have some great questions, but we've run out of time. So I'm just going to finish with one, which was in fact the second question that was asked. What insights does the 2017 Richmond Tigers Football Club AFL victory offer for diversity in Australia?
So do we get that question?
We actually did get that question.
Okay, so
You could write a book on this, I know, but
I have, yes. A woman in charge in what was otherwise a male environment. So putting Peggy O'Neill in charge of that club as president unleashed a form of creativity that that club didn't know existed. And she didn't arrive with the sort of hang-ups of ex-players and small business people who wanted to be the loudest voice in that room. Once you put a woman in charge, you're able to share power and distribute power according to people's expertise. Now, on grand final day, it's quite interesting that the playing group began to look like the country once they made the switch at the top. On grand final day, the 6 players who polled votes in the Norm Smith medal for best on ground. There were no Adelaide players, unfortunately, who polled. There was a son of a Maori, Dustin Martin. There was an Indigenous Australian, Shane Edwards. There was a Muslim Australian, Basha Hooley. There was a Jehovah's Witness, Alex Rance. There was a teenager from South Australia, Jack Graham, and the 6th one has escaped me at the moment. He'll probably kill me if I've forgotten his name. But basically, every part of Australia was represented in the best 6 players on the ground.
except the women.
Except the women. No, but she was on the ground.
She was
on the ground getting the first hug from every one of the players. I mean, that was her premiership as much as anyone's.
You seem to know a lot about that team. I don't know who you support.
Oh, Team Australia, I think, mate. Sorry.
On that note, please thank George Megalogenis.
Thank you.